This is a special instructional video on how to understand and study Mount's vocabulary concerning verbs. We couldn't introduce or describe Mount's vocabulary list for verbs until we went over chapter 22 with verbal roots and introduced the second aorist tense and its forms. What we need to remember is that one, whenever we memorize the lexical form, make sure that you also memorize the verbal root. And if the lexical stem and the verbal root happens to be the same, which is the case for many verbs, then there's not much you need to remember. It's simply the same form. But especially for verbs like balo, where you have the lexical stem bal with a double lambda, but the verbal root is different, so they're not the same. As a means of remembering how to form certain tenses, you simply have to memorize the verbal root along with the lexical form. And for something as complicated, for example, as Lego, which means I say or tell, it actually has 3 different verbal roots that are used in 3 different tenses. And so you might ask, well, how do I know which verbal root to use for which tense? And that's, again, a matter of memorization. You'll just simply have to memorize that leg is used for the present and imperfect tense, ape is used for the aorist tense, and for the remaining tenses, air is used. And that's something I memorized. So notice that, let's go back to our regular verb luo. Let's go back to luo and look at the forms that he lists. In a typical vocabulary list from Mount's, he gives the lexical form and he gives you the verbal root. He gives you the English definition. He tells you how many times it's used in the New Testament. So luo and its forms are used 42 times. And if it's introduced as your chapter of vocabulary, he tells you what chapter it's first introduced. In this case, luo was introduced in chapter 16. Then he lists what we call here are the principal parts. Principal parts. And these are the first person singular forms for the following tenses. And so this is the imperfect tense, this is the future tense, this is the aorist tense, and you have not learned these yet, so we're going to wait on those. The lexical form is your present tense form, and then what's in parentheses is your imperfect, then follows the future, and then follows the aorist active. Now, this is a first aorist form, which you have not learned yet. So you're not responsible for this form elusa until we study chapter 23. But look at balo. Balo, and it has its verbal root bal. It is a form that you should study. You have a balon, which is the imperfect form. And then you have a balon again, but notice here this is a second aorist, which we just learned. And the difference between a balon imperfect and a balon second aorist is that the aorist uses the verbal root with a single lambda, while the imperfect uses the lexical form with a double lambda. Now, you have not learned, because this is a liquid verb, you have not learned this liquid future form yet. So we're going to wait on talking about this form until another module. But notice what I've done. For each verb, balo, or luo, or lego, I'm memorizing the verbal root and the present form, which is the lexical form luo, the imperfect form, the future form, and the aorist active form if it's a second aorist, only if it's a second aorist. And when I learn chapter 23, then I'll learn all the first aorist forms. You need to be able to name the first person singular forms for each of the tenses you've studied. A reminder again, if you want to know where all the verbal roots are listed, go ahead and study Mount's textbook, page 177. And if you go to page 200 in Mount's, it lists all the verbs that use the second aorist. So all the verbs that use the second aorist are listed on page 200, at least the verbs you've learned so far. And then as you learn more verb forms, then you'll have to add to that list.